Not long ago, I revisited the story of the Verrückt Marines. Smokey, John Banana, Tank Dempsey and Paxton Gunner Rich, all characters who were very mysterious, okay, besides from Dempsey, who was a part of the main cast, John and Smokey weren't, and Paxton for the longest time was known as the fourth unknown mystery character. It wasn't until years later that we learned about his backstory. It's crews like this in Zombies that interest me because we know everything about the storyline at this point. I can tell you everything about Primus, Ultimus, Victus, the mobsters, but there are a couple of maps that contain characters that we don't know much about, that were almost forgotten, that the Canorium doesn't document. And maybe you've wondered about the Nacht Der Untoten crew. I mean the originals, because in the Black Ops 1 version of the map, or Black Ops 3, we played as Richtof and Takeo Nikolai and Dempsey, but in the original, it was once again 4 unknown Marines. But now that that part of the storyline is over, do we know any more about them? Well, like I said, Nacht Der Untoten was the beginning. Releasing in World at War in 2008, this tiny survival map would go on to become one of the most iconic locations in gaming history. At that time, however, Treyarch had no idea Zombies would become such a massive success. It was simply intended to be a bonus hidden game mode after completing the campaign, and because of that, Nacht Der Untoten was incredibly simple. There are no major Easter eggs, no elaborate quests, and none of the complex storytelling the series would later be known for, and that applies to the characters. And I could say this exact same thing for every Zombies map until Derice. Shino Numa is a good example. That was the first time Richtof and Takeo Nikolai and Dempsey were introduced, taken from the campaign, but they had no backstory, so if that was the only map we ever got them in, maybe they would be in a similar situation to the Nacht Marines. One-off characters with no backstory because Zombies was not big enough at that time for Treyarch to even consider it. If Nacht ended up releasing in Black Ops 1 with the same characters, I can guarantee you they would have had an elaborate backstory. It just sucks for them that they were the first. An experiment in a way, with no real thought process behind them. Anyway, when it comes to the story of Nacht, which they intertwine with, the events began during World War II. Group 935 began experimenting with Element 115, attempting to create an undead army for Nazi Germany, and as these experiments progressed, both Element 115 and the resulting zombies were transported between various Group 935 bases. But during one of these transports, disaster struck. An Allied aircraft flying overhead malfunctioned and crashed directly into one of the German convoys carrying both Element 115 and the Undead, and it was that collision that released the zombies. Only 4 unknown American Marines survived that plane crash. But with the Undead now closing in on them from every direction, the soldiers retreated into a nearby abandoned bunker, desperately barricading windows and scavenging weapons in a final attempt to survive. Throughout the night, they fought off wave after wave of zombies. Weapons started mysteriously appearing on the walls. The mystery box offered more powerful equipment. At the time, they and us had no idea where all of this stuff was coming from. Later on down the line, we learned these were supplied by Dr. Monty himself, which I'll come on to, but getting back to the Marines, despite every effort, it wasn't enough. And eventually, the Undead overwhelmed the bunker, and all 4 of them were killed. And that's basically the entire original story of this map. No hidden ending, no secret escape, no surviving heroes, just 4 soldiers making one final grand stand against impossible odds. That was all Treyarch needed to hook us in. But now, of course, almost 20 years later, we want more. We want to know who they were, what they were doing, and to be fair, if you read the Canorium regarding this event, it says, on June the 4th, 1945, the 4 Marines, after surviving this crash, held out against the Undead for as long as they could. It doesn't actually say they died. That's just the assumption. That was what would make sense. What happens in the majority of our Zombies maps in instances like this, because there are unique situations, is the Undead do not stop. And eventually, even if you get up to round 999, you are going to die. Like I said, there's been exceptions. 5 in the original timeline, JFK and everyone survive, but in a fractured timeline, they all die. And that's related to what happens in Ascension. When the zombie outbreak stops at the Cosmodrome, it also stops at the Pentagon. Or if you look at Call of the Dead, George Romero and his cast of characters were doing absolutely fine shooting a movie in Siberia, but it was only when Richtof and Takeo Nikolai and Dempsey teleported there was when the zombie outbreak begun, because Samantha was sending them after them. And I'm assuming once Ultimus left Call of the Dead, the zombies left with them, because they weren't specifically attempting to kill George, and the crew. But in Nacht's situation, the zombie outbreak happens because a plane crashes into German army trucks transporting zombies and Element 115 between bases, which causes the outbreak. I would like to say the zombies were not specifically sent here by Samantha, for example, in order to attack these characters, but we look at the story and we know during that time, well, yellow-eyed zombies, which is what they were controlled by Samantha, but she didn't actually enter the MPD until later on. Nacht takes place before the events of Doris. It's something I've never really thought about, but who was actually controlling the zombies in Nacht? I suppose that's not the main point of the video, but the zombies weren't sent here to kill these characters. It was all just an accident, so hey, maybe there is a small chance that they survived. Perhaps they managed to kill off every single zombie that was caused by the incident and lived. I just think it's very unlikely, and the fact that Treyarch don't say what happened to them, this might be the only situation where we don't have a conclusion for a set of characters. We know what happened to the Verrückt Marines, we know what happened to the 5 cast, we know what happened to Victus, the Mob of the Dead characters, the Shadows of Evil crew. We were never specifically told whether the Nacht Marines lived or died. And also why they were important to the story, because they have things like the mystery box and the war weapons, which are given by Dr. Monty. But why would he choose to help them out? They were clearly important to the cycle, and everything involved in it needs to work out exactly how it did. But what effect does this small map have on the overarching loop? Why does it matter to Monty if these Marines survived or died? Why would their death or survival mean the continuation or ending of the cycle? I don't actually know, because in later iterations of the map, Black Ops 1, we returned, this time playing as Richtof and Taku, Nikolai and Dempsey, so I could understand in that situation why the map would be important, because they're important, or in Zombies Chronicles, but even then, it was never clear why these characters went here. Forgetting storyline logic, Treyarch just wanted to use them for these remakes, but if you want to follow the lore, there is no explanation, as Monty says.
Nacht Der Untoten. That translates as Night of the Dead. I learned that tonight. Been trying to scrub up on my German, you see. Anyway, it happened in an old concrete building on an airfield somewhere in, I don't know where. I remember it being really small, simple by today's standards. I think there was a fog. Not a lot of it, certainly not coming into the building itself. You know what I just realized? You weren't even there. At least not at first. It was some other random, forgettable soldiers that had the misfortune to live through that horrible night, or Nacht, as it was actually known. Yeah, I speak German now.
Unlike many other maps in the storyline, Ultimus had no obvious objective at Nacht Der Untoten. There's no Easter egg, no quest for them to complete. Throughout the timeline, nearly every destination they visit serves a purpose. Sometimes they travel intentionally, sometimes they accidentally overload a teleporter and end up somewhere expected, but Nacht Der Untoten doesn't clearly fit into either category. As a result, many of us believe this version of the map, the Zombies Chronicles one and the Black Ops 1, exists in an alternate timeline, a variation of the cycle that doesn't matter. Similar to the trailers where we see they die hundreds of times, and when that happens the cycle resets. This is an example of that, a variation of the cycle, rather than replacing the original events. Those original events, as told through the Canorium, are clearly the original Marines. But why they were integral to the cycle is just as much of a mystery. So there we go. The fate of these characters is actually up in air, but I would be more inclined to say they did die. As far as their identity goes though, we still don't know. There are theories, but nothing that's backed with proof. They are just random Marines. Anyway, there we go. Drop a like rating if you've enjoyed the video. Make sure you subscribe to stay up to date with the latest content on the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, goodbye.